Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Bore You to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy. Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast, the podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from The Rhyme and Reason of Country Life, written by Susan Fenimore Cooper and published in 1854. This story looks at the beauty of country life. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest that you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those new to the podcast, it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community that we've built together. This podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you'll hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with support from subscribers and patrons, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. Thank you to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week, whether through the website or the podcast app. Your messages mean the world to me. A special thank you to the new subscribers, as well as existing subscribers and Patreon sponsors. My goal is to keep this podcast free and accessible to everyone. That is why you hear a quick ad at the beginning of each episode. It helps generate financial support for the creation of the podcast. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, here are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your podcast app and leave a comment. Become a subscriber for $2.99 per month by clicking on the link in the show notes. This will remove ads at the beginning of the episode and support episode creation. If subscribing is not possible, and I completely appreciate that not everyone is in a position to do that, an easy way to help is by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. If you would like to become a patron or sponsor, you can do that at boreyoutosleep.com. You can also say hello to me by visiting the website boreyoutosleep.com. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. The Rhyme and Reason of Country Life. Introduction. The ancient classical writers of the world are thought to have shown but little sensibility to that natural beauty with which the earth has been clothed, as with a magnificent garment by her almighty Creator. Those of their works which have been preserved to us are declared by critics, rarely to bear evidence in much depth of feeling of this kind. The German scholars are understood to have been the first to broach this opinion, the first to point out the fact and to comment on what appears a singular inconsistency. If we bear in mind, says Schiller, the beautiful scenery with which the Greeks were surrounded, and remember the opportunities possessed by a people living in so genial a climate of entering into the free enjoyment of the contemplation of nature, and observe how comfortable were the mode of thought, the bent of their imaginations, and the habits of their lives to the simplicity of nature, which was so faithfully reflected in their poetic works. We cannot fail to remark with surprise how few traces are to be met among them of the sentimental interest with which we in modern times attach ourselves to the individual characteristics of natural scenery. The Greek poet is certainly in the highest degree correct, faithful and circumstantial in his descriptions of nature, but his heart has more share in his words than if he were treating of a garment, a shield, or a suit of armor. Nature seems to interest his understanding more than his moral perceptions. He does not cling to her chasms with the fervor and the plaintive passion of the poet of modern times. This passage of Schiller, quoted in Cosmos, is supported by similar observations of M. de Humboldt himself. Specific descriptions of nature occur only as accessories, for in Grecian art all things are centered in the sphere of human life. And again, the description of nature in its manifold richness of form, as a distinct branch of poetic literature, was wholly unknown to the Greeks. The landscape appears among them merely as the background of the picture, of which human figures constitute the main subject. Touches of description must, of course, occasionally occur, and whenever these are found, the harmony of Grecian taste gives them the highest beauty possible. The many noble similes and comparisons scattered through the greater poems form admirable detached pictures, but they occupy the attention very bravely. A rapid glance is thrown upon the hill, the river, or the wood, rather for the purpose of affording greater relief to the figures in the foreground than of enduring the sketch of these features of the earth with any charm or importance in itself. But it is quite impossible to believe for a moment that the Greeks, so fully alive to the spirit of beauty in all its other forms, should have been blind to its effects in the natural world. Other ways of accounting for the apparent inconsistency must be sought for, and the peculiar character and position of the people would seem to suggest these. It was quite consistent with the condition of the world at that early period, and of the Greeks in particular, that nature and art should not then hold the same relative places which they occupy today. Art was still in its youth, and of more importance to them than it is to us. Nature, with all her untold wealth, her unharvested magnificence, lay before them close at hand, always within reach. There was no fear that she should fail them. But human art was in its earlier stages of culture. Every successive step was watched with most lively interest. Every progressive movement became a great importance, while the genius of the Greeks particularly led them to feel extreme delight in every achievement of the kind. In fact, all their highest enjoyments flowed from this source, and into this sphere they threw themselves with their whole soul. Whatever susceptibility to the grandeur and beauty of the inanimate creation was felt among them, sought therefore rather to express itself in forms more positive than the voice of song. What, for instance, was the most noble of their temples but the image in Dorian marble of some grand primeval grove, whose grey, columnar trunks they found reflected in the waves of the Aegean Sea? What were the vase, and the vine wreathed about its lip, but the repetition of living forms of fruits and foliage growing in the vale of Tempe, or at the foot of Hymettus? The Greek mind thus beheld the whole external world chiefly through the medium of human art. An interesting and very striking instance of this peculiarity occurs in the Iliad. No natural object which has a place in the poem, neither the sea nor the skies, neither the streams nor the mountains, all glowing as these were with the purple light of the Grecian atmosphere, could draw from Homer a description filling half the space allotted by him to the shield of Achilles. Nay, more, observe that where rural life and its accessories appear the most distinctly in his verse, it is not the reality which he shows us. We do not ourselves tread the brown soil of the freshly tiled fallow. We do not pass along the one narrow path in the vineyard, amid the purple clusters, but we are called upon to behold these objects, sight to be admired of all, as they lie curiously graven by the hand of Vulcan on the bronze buckler of the hero, where he, with devices multiform, the disk capacious charged, toiling with skill divine. Their very religion was but a work of art, a brilliant web of the human imagination into which, as on the medal of Vulcan, their poets had wrought, where Olympic deities passed to and fro, with grace and spirit unequalled, but moving ever by the springs of the most common of human passions. All the inanimate objects of the visible creation had their allotted places in this gorgeous, imaginative tissue, though still appearing under associations purely human. They had, in short, no conceptions of nature independent of man. To them the whole world was but the shield of Achilles, with the same mythology, the same philosophy as the Greeks. The Romans are admitted to have been essentially plagiarists. They saw the earth in this sense, with the eyes of the Greeks. Their literature has even been accused of a greater dearth of poetical observation as regards to the natural world than that of their predecessors. The practical realities of life engrossed their attention more exclusively. A colossal selfishness was their striking national characteristic, a characteristic which was alike the cause, first of their political prosperity, and later of their downfall. Rome was their deity. To her daily needs or interests or pleasures, all was sacrificed. They cared little for the mountains and forests and streams of the earth, provided all the wealth and magnificence of these were brought over Roman ways to swell the triumph of the Forum. It has been remarked that Caesar could pass the Alps, then comparatively an unknown region, without one allusion to their sublime character. Still, a body of men like the great Latin writers could not, of course, exist devoid of susceptibility to the beauty of the inanimate world, and many passages may be drawn from their poems bearing witness to this fact. Although, says M. de Humboldt, there is no individual rural portraiture in the Aeneid yet, a deep and intimate comprehension of nature is depicted in soft colours, where, for instance, has the gentle play of the waves or the stillness of night been more happily described. The modern reader, however, is still left to wonder that poets so great should not have delighted more frequently in enlarging upon similar topics, and that even in many of their elegiac works social life should so exclusively fill up the space. We should have rather supposed that when the earth stood in her primitive freshness, in the morning of her existence, her wealth of beauty as yet unsung, that the works of the first great poets would have been filled with a simple reflection of her natural glory. But as we have seen, such was not the case with the writers of Greece or of Rome, and, as we have already ventured to intimate, it would appear that the great intellectual activity of those races connected with the period of time filled by them, where so wide a field opened in every direction, became in itself a prominent cause of this peculiar deficiency of their literature. Whatever admiration they felt for nature expressed itself in positive forms of art, or in an imaginative system of mythology, rather than in song. But something of a different spirit appears to have actuated the old Asiatic nations. The ancient Indian races, for instance, were more contemplative in character, and more vivid impressions of natural objects are revealed in their writings. The Sanskrit hymns and the heroic poems of the same language are said to contain fine descriptive passages. The main subject of these writings, says M. de Humboldt, speaking of the Sanskrit Vedas, are the veneration and praise of nature. A poem called The Seasons, and one starts at the familiar name, with another work called The Messenger of the Clouds, are full, we are told, of the same spirit. They were written by Kalidasa, a contemporary of Virgil and Horace. It would have given us pleasure to offer the reader a few fragments from writings so ancient and so interesting. One would have liked to compare a passage from the Sanskrit Seasons with those so celebrated, and so familiar from our own language and modern time, but no English versions are found within reach. The fact, however, of this characteristic of the Sanskrit poems is placed beyond reasonable doubt by the declarations of many distinguished men of learning, more particularly among the German scholars. The Chinese, that singular people which for ages have separated themselves from the rest of the earth by impassable barriers of prejudice and mystery, are now found, as glimpses are opening into their interior, to have long shown some partiality for natural beauty. Among other poems touching them more or less upon subjects of this kind, they have one bearing the simple name of the garden, which was written by Shema Kwang, a celebrated statesman, some 8 or 9 centuries since, which is said to contain agreeable descriptive passages. The sketch of a hermitage among rocks and evergreen woods, and a fine, extensive water view over one of their great rivers, are especially referred to. Lu Shu, another ancient writer of theirs, dwells at length on the subject of pleasure grounds, for which he gives admirable directions in the English style, at a period when a really fine garden was not to be found in all northern Europe. A short translation from a passage of his will be found in the following sections. Gardening, in fact, appears to have been the sphere of which Chinese love of nature has especially sought to unfold itself. That perception of beauty, of colouring, and of nicety of detail, very general among them, shows itself here in perfection. They have long been great florists, and have delighted in writing verses upon particular flowers and fruit trees. Garden and song were thus closely connected by them, and if one may judge from brief views received through others, their poetry has very frequently indeed something of a horticultural character. Their busy practical habits and close inspection of detail would easily incline them in this direction, but as yet nothing grand or very elevated has been given to us by translators. The Hebrew poets stand alone. Their position is absolutely different from that of all profane writers, and places them at a distance from the usual limits of a mere literary comparison. They only, as priests and prophets of the one living God, beheld the natural world in the holy light of truth. Small as was the space the children of Israel filled among the nations of the earth, the humblest individual of their tribes knew that the God of Abraham was the Lord God of hosts, and that all things visible were but the works of his hands. The Lord made the heavens, and the earth, and the sea, and all in them is. They bowed the knee to no one object, in the heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. Truth is, of its nature, sublime. No fiction of the human imagination, even in the highest and richest forms which it is capable of assuming, can approach to that majesty which is her inherent prerogative. The views of the earth, open to the children of Israel, had naturally, therefore, a grandeur far beyond what the Greeks, with all the luxuriance of their florid mythology, could attain to. Of this fact, thanks to the translations of the sacred writings in the hands of all who speak the English tongue, any one of us is capable of judging. The extreme excellence of the Psalms, merely in the sense of literary compositions, and independently of the far higher claims they have upon mankind, has never failed to impress itself deeply on all minds open to such perceptions. The 19th Psalm, with the unequalled grandeur of its opening verses, the 23rd, with its pastoral sweetness, the 104th, with the fullness of its natural pictures, the 107th, the 96th, the 145th, the 148th, with others of a similar character, will recur to every reader. It is generally admitted that, throughout the range of ancient profane writing, nothing has been brought to light which can equal these. Even for sweetness, also the old Hebrew writers were very remarkable. The most celebrated author and literary artist of modern Germany, and one little likely to have been influenced on such a subject by warmth of religious feeling, has left it as his written opinion that the Book of Ruth, usually attributed to the prophet Samuel, is the loveliest specimen of epic and idle poetry which we possess. but the history of Jacob and his family, and the personal story of David in all its details, with other episodes easily pointed out, are almost equally full of this beautiful pastoral spirit. The same inspired pens which have dwelt on the grandest events of which time has any knowledge, have not disdained to move the lesser chords of human sympathies and affections. It was the most honoured of the prophets who so nobly recorded the greatest of all physical facts, the creation of light. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And on the page immediately following, while still occupied in recording the grand successive stages of the creation, he condescends to note that out of the earth the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight. This simple phrase, taken in connection with all its sublime relations of time and place, has a gracious tenderness, a compassionate beneficence of detail which moves the heart deeply. All the delight which the trees of the wood have afforded to men, independently of their uses, the many peaceful homes they have overshadowed, the many eyes they have gladdened, all the festal joys of the race in which their branches have waved, seem to crowd the mind in one grateful picture, and force from our lips the familiar invocation, "O all ye green things upon earth, bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him forever." The most ancient writings of the world thus afford evidence that in those remote ages the perception of natural beauty was not wanting in the human heart. Different races and individual men have varied greatly in giving expression to the feeling. David and Homer, the Indian and the Roman, may have sung in very different tones, but wherever intellectual life was at all active, there some strain, at least, from the great hymn was heard. But very early, in what may be called Christian literature, this feeling began to receive a fresh impulse and a new direction. On the same soil and among the same races where, in the height of heathen civilization, it had never received adequate expression, both in Italy and in Greece, the eye of the believer was gradually opened to clearer and more worthy views of the creation. "Look upward," says Saint Chrysostom, "to the vault of heaven, and around thee on the open fields in which herds graze by the waterside. Who does not despise all the creations of art, when in the stillness of his spirit he watches with admiration the rising of the sun, as it pours its golden light over the face of the earth, when resting on the thick grass beside the murmuring spring, or beneath the sombre shade of a thick and leafy tree, the eye rests on the far receding and hazy distance." Similar passages may also be gathered from the letters of Saint Basil and Saint Gregory, fathers of the Greek Church, and still earlier instances of this Christian view of the earth are quoted from the writings of a Roman lawyer, Minucius Felix, who lived in the beginning of the 3rd century. His evening rambles on the shores of the Mediterranean in the neighbourhood of Ostia were very feelingly described in pages which have been preserved to our own time. The Christian Church possessed a most rich inheritance in the Hebrew literature, and the constant use of the psalms of the temple in her public services would alone suffice to produce in the minds of the people a deep impression of the goodness and majesty of the divine Creator as revealed in his works. The Canticle of the Three Children, composed before the foundation of Rome, and which from the early ages of Christianity to the present hour has formed a portion of public worship, is an exalted offering of praise with which we are all familiar. O ye works of the Lord, bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him forever. And in the sublime anthem of the Te Deum, we have another earnest, unceasing expression of a feeling inseparable from Christianity. We praise thee, O God, we acknowledge thee to the Lord. Heaven and earth are full of the majesty of thy glory. It is indeed revealed truth only which has opened to the human mind views of the creation at all worthy of its dignity. It is from her teaching that we learn to appreciate justly the different works of the Deity, in their distinctive characters, to allot to each its own definite position. There is no confusion in her views. She shows us the earth and the creatures which people it in a clear light. She tells us positively that all things are but the works of his holy hands, the visible expression of an almighty wisdom and power and love, and as she speaks, the idle phantoms of the human imagination, the puerile deities of the heathen world, the wretched fallacies of presumptuous philosophy vanish and flee away from the face of the earth, like the mists and shadows of night at the approach of the light of day. Not one of the 1,000 banners of idolatry, whether unfurled on the mountain tops, or waving in the groves, or floating on the streams, but falls before her. She points out to man his own position, and that of all about him. He is Lord of the earth, and of all its creatures, the herb of the field, the trees of the wood, the fowls of the air, the fishes of the sea, everything living that moveth upon earth, all have been given into his hand, all are subject to his dominion, all are the gifts of Jehovah. But here, time had enabled Christian civilization and its ennobling lessons to make any positive progress, or to produce any lasting impression on the character of general literature. The empire was overwhelmed by races wholly barbarous. A period of darkness and disorder ensued, during which the very art of writing seems to have been all but forgotten. A few rude, unfinished sketches were all that could be expected from such an age, and in these man himself would naturally engross the attention. In societies only half civilized, man as an individual must always fill a bolder and more prominent position than in those where order and knowledge and truth are more widely diffused. He has in such a state of things far greater power for evil over his fellows. Every step becomes of immediate importance, for it is associated with 1,000 perils. Every turn of private passion, unchecked by vital vigour of law or religion, may work out a fatal tragedy, and consequently the individual, either as tyrant or victim, or champion, excites unceasing fear and flattery or pity and commiseration, or gratitude and admiration. Wild legends, now warlike, now religious in spirit, naturally belonged to those centuries. No doubt the birds of heaven sang, and the flowers of the field bloomed in those ages, but we have scanty record of their existence. The eye of man was fixed on darker objects, his ear was filled with fiercer sounds. Slowly, however, civilization and social order, those natural accessories of the Christian faith, were making progress. But the most striking efforts of reviving intelligence at this period did not assume the shape of letters. That latent poetical spirit, never wholly extinct in the human heart, sought for development during those ages through other channels. Under the hand of the religious architect, pious, though lamentably superstitious, the dignity of the forest was once more embodied in novel and imposing labours of art. Scarce a fine effect of the branching woods which was not successfully repeated with great richness of detail in Gothic stone. The beauty of the vegetation, in its noblest forms, must have been deeply impressed on the hearts of the men who, with Teutonic patience, raised those magnificent piles. Every American familiar with the beautiful and varied effects of old forests of blended growth, where fir and pines cross their evergreen branches amid the lighter tracery of deciduous trees, may have often noted some single fir, rising tall and spire-like far above the lesser grove, into the light of sun and star, some similar evergreen, rooted in the soil of Europe, was doubtless the original of that most beautiful of Christian architectural forms, the church spire of the Middle Ages. And that concludes tonight's readings. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story. If you're not quite tired yet, please feel free to listen to another episode of the Boy to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.